Welcome to the new Bauhaus debate, debate for a more inclusive Europe, another online event of the Jan van Eyck Academy. I am the director, Hisham Khalidi. Welcome to all the participants tonight, and the public, and the speakers, and the members, and the new European Bauhaus team of the European Commission, signatories of the letter Objections to the Term New European Bauhaus, the participants and the team members of the Jan van Eyck Academy. I would first like to thank all of the members that have worked so hard and the effort they put in for this crucial event and in the setting up of this event, and also leading up to this event with writing and formulating directions and writing the letter. Also, I would like to thank Dr. Rolando Vazquez, who is with us today, for his unwavering effort helping us to understand the subject matter that we have in front of us through his experience and knowledge of decoloniality, and he will be speaking tonight right after me. I'm trying to look at the camera, and I have the screens of you right here, so I'm doing my best to point myself towards you. If I don't, just nod on me, and I will go back to the camera facing myself there. So the structure of tonight is as follows. I will be speaking for 15 minutes explaining how this project came about and what the key reasons were to write the letter and subsequently writing the article together with Rolando. And what we have done so far and where we are right now, and possibly hint to where we think that we should be heading. And after me, as said, we have Rolando, who will be speaking his mind relating to the naming of the cultural project of the European Green Deal through the lens of his work on decoloniality. Then afterwards we take a break, 10 minutes, be back at 8, and after which we will have a larger discussion with all of you. And the way the discussion is structured is as follows. I've asked some key people with whom I've had written this objection letter at first to prepare some 5 minutes of thought relating to what they think of the term New European Bauhaus and what they think how we should be moving forward. After which I will open up the discussion to everyone to ask questions, make comments, and etc. And also, in order to have a vivid discussion, I would like to ask you all to prepare your questions, and if possible also to first write down your questions or make your remark in the Zoom and in the YouTube chat. Also, after the speech and keynote of Rolando, there will also be some 10 minutes that we have for questions. So please, you can direct some questions then too. Yeah, and then we will have an open discussion. Also, I would like to stress that we are recording and live streaming this event, after which we will share this on our online platforms. And also, I would like to remark that this is a Zoom meeting. Please keep your cameras on as much as possible so we can see each other's non-verbal responses. So, how did we get here? So in November last year, we set out to write a letter of objection to the European Commission about the use of the term New European Bauhaus as a cultural project for the European Green Deal. We stated in the letter that while we support the EU's Commission's bold undertaking, which invites cultural actors to forge change through an interdisciplinary approach to art, design, technology, and science, we find it unfortunate and misinformed to name it after the Bauhaus School. We felt that the use of this term would be non-inclusive and Eurocentric in nature. We is the initiators of the letter, as well as the people who have undersigned the letter. Perhaps at first it was my intuition that led me to want to object to the term. From a Dutch-Moroccan background, this somehow felt excluding me from the picture of a plural and multi-layered Europe. Next to this, I felt, should not a Green Deal be met with a beyond borders approach, as the climate crisis we are facing can only be tackled globally? So I contacted Rolando Vazquez, who is a professor of sociology at the University College of the University of Utrecht, and one of the noted scholars on decoloniality, and asked him the question of whether he thought the same. Was this naming non-inclusive? Would it exclude people from the project, and why? Well, he felt the same and offered to be part to form a critique of this process. At the same time, I contacted several partners and professionals in the art and design field and asked them the same question. So there it began. A letter was written and sent out to the networks. It was signed more than 450 times by professionals, leaders of cultural organizations, and concerned citizens. In the letter, we state literally, and I open quote, "We are deeply concerned that the title, New European Bauhaus, is inherently not inclusive. The European Green Deal should not be tied to a specific place or ideology. It should instead have a plural approach that can create common ground for a multitude of voices and worldviews." End quote. Thus, we also offered a solution, and I quote again, "If the cultural European Green Deal is to become a prosperous and sustainable project, this criticality and these multiple histories should be part of the overarching narrative." And this is in fact what we can add to the table, to insert this criticality in this overarching narrative. After initiating this process of the letter, Rolando and I set out to write an article under the title, "A New Bauhaus, ? The Debate for a More Inclusive Europe," from which the title of this conference is derived. It was published in several magazines and on our website. In this article, we lay out in more detail our objection to the term. What are the pitfalls? What concerns do we have in the usage of such name? We started out with the image of the sunken boat in Paris that Le Corbusier made in the 1920s for the Salvation Army, commissioned by the Singer family. This barge, which was made of solid concrete, sank after a storm surge tilted the boat against the wharf. For me, this image, and I know because I walked past by this boat almost every day when I was working and living in Paris, was representative of the decline of the idea of a modernist world due to the effects of climate change, and that because the water level of the Seine is rising every year. It was as a sign to rethink our legacy, a history on which we have built our present world, a history that we must overcome to brace ourselves for the climate challenges we're facing. Here in front of us was this modernist legacy of a social and better world, one that is constructed from concrete, paid for by the fortune makers of the global fashion industry. If we are to move forward with an inclusive and plural approach to the European Green Deal, we must draw our attention to the entanglement between our modernist legacy, colonialism, extraction, exclusion, and the climate crisis we are in. We must put an emphasis on this entanglement so that we can reveal and overcome the inherent inequalities and hierarchies that arise from modernist thinking. And as said in the article, open quote, "What we need is a transformation of our ethics of life and our forms of social engagement. Culture can set the stage to bring about these changes, but only if we begin from a recognition of what has gone wrong in legacies that prioritize profit over social well-being." End of quote. And also important to note, and this is also from the article, I open, "Our critique of Eurocentrism is not a critique of Europe, but an appeal to treasure and nurture the diverse continent on which we live. It is the very basis for democratic participation in an ecological project that can benefit all of us." So, we must appeal for a more horizontal structure, such as civic assemblies and town hall meetings, to rename and reorient the cultural European Green Deal towards a truly transparent and plural process in collaboration and in consultation with those likely to be most impacted by its outcomes. And also we need a name that empowers the idea that a Europe responsive to climate collapse is a Europe that addresses social inequality and intersectional forms of discrimination. We need a name that results from a process of listening and participation. This, we believe, can bring about a transformative movement for an environmentally sustainable, plural, and socially just Europe. So after this, we had 2 meetings with key members of the new European Bauhaus team, and I would like to thank Xavier Trouzard and his team, and Ruth Reichstein and her team for very constructive meetings that we had and in which we deliberated on the naming of the project. Not everyone could make it tonight, unfortunately, but we will be recording this event and we will make sure to share this with them. Um, in this meeting was stated by the team, the New European Bauhaus team, that they acknowledge the need for a participatory process and are aware of the importance of creating social ownership for the project in order to be successful. They appreciated our willingness to not only critique, but to help and support the initiative. Although the European Commission does feel that the title New European Bauhaus represents the initiative by invoking the interdisciplinary, innovative approach that they are looking for, while admitting that the reference to the Bauhaus has its flaws. They are open to the idea that a debate about the name can be part of the co-creation design phase of the project, which will end in July this year. So this begs the question, how can we work under a name such as the New European Bauhaus? How could we add the idea of inclusivity within and under such umbrella term? Also, I would like to praise the efforts of the New European Bauhaus to add inclusivity as an important parameter and pillar next to beauty and sustainability in the construction of the project. We are very happy with this addition, and it is very important. So we must back this project, although I would like to stress the importance that we do so with an awareness of what constitutes the name and the title. And this could lead us to a profound debate on what an inclusive Europe could look like. And this discussion will inherently lead us to make the connection to what is Europe today. Perhaps a fluid plurality composed of manifold experiences, voices, and histories, as we also say in the article, an articulation of differences that cannot be reduced. As such, the story of modernism is connected to the story of the diaspora, the disenfranchised and the precarious in our society. Maybe that's how it connects to me personally. And why would we use such a name that has a murky and undefined history, in which women had partly a place, subscribing to men's genius, in which men were propelled to superstars, defining design schools all over the world, and that marked our definition of how a designed world should look like? At the same time, it is only one woman who has won the Pritzker Prize, and that is Zaha Hadid. Bauhaus is the epitome of modernist and Eurocentric thinking, a kind of thinking that lies at the heart of the climate crisis. It is the validation of an industrial functionalist and a universalist approach, as laid out in our article, a world that is designed and governed by the metrics of an overall and over-encompassing system. That is the problem here, a system that governs all, whilst what we are trying to put forward is an inclusive and pluriversal idea of practice, be it art, design, industry, or governance. And this is possible only if we have this discussion of our European legacy before we move further, before we commit ourselves to moving any further, unable to move out of the modernist trap. So I would like to open up now for the keynote of Rolando Vazquez, and I will introduce him, after which I will take a seat at the table, and then we can also ask some questions after the keynote. I would like to welcome Rolando Vazquez. He is Associate Professor of Sociology at the University College Roosevelt of Utrecht University and author of Vistas of Modernity, Decolonial Aesthesis and the End of the Contemporary. I will give it to Rolando right now, and then we can move place. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Hisham. Thank you for the wonderful introduction, which I think in itself is a keynote. And thank you all for being present, for signing the letter, for being concerned with this debate. Thank you also for having your cameras on. It's very nice to see faces, even if, as I'm normally now saying to my students, one thing is to see the sea live, and another thing is to see the sea on the screen, or a forest live, or a forest on the screen. So of course we are missing the co-presence, but at least we know that we are there. I will start by connecting to what Hisham was saying, coming from a decolonial perspective, and to show why we are arguing for moving beyond the heritage of European modernism towards an idea of a plural Europe, or shall we say plural Europes in plural. And in this heritage of European modernity, what in the decolonial framework we call modernity in general, is it includes also the postmodern. So the postmodern is not the overcoming of modernity, but it's just one of the phases of this major model of civilization that uh, that is very importantly sustained in um, two principles that the Bauhaus name is not questioning. And one is the principle of Eurocentrism, a Eurocentrism that makes of Europe the center of geography and the present of history, a Eurocentrism that we know was only possible through colonialism, because before colonial times, Europe could not represent itself as the center of geography and the now of history. So Eurocentrism becomes only possible with the colonial enterprise. And it is a legacy of colonialism. So to decolonize Europe means to overcome a Eurocentric Europe, right? A Eurocentrism that also caused a lot of impoverishment of Europe itself and a loss of its own plurality. The other principle that is carried in this project of civilization is anthropocentrism, the idea that the human is separated from nature. The very idea of nature as separated from the human is a product of anthropocentrism. And so we think in this long line of modernity that starts in colonialism for decolonial thinking in 1492 is the long line of a history of progressive anthropocentrism and Eurocentrism that will become Western centrism. And it has led us to the loss of Earth, so what we have called earthlessness. Anthropocentrism leads to earthlessness. And Eurocentrism has led us to worldlessness, to the loss of plurality of worlds, to the silencing of other worlds, to the erasure of other ways of being in the world, to the impossibility of other ways of being in the world. So now, with this very brief introduction, you can see why, from a decolonial perspective, we would not be happy with the term Bauhaus. Because if we are looking for a plural Europe, and a Europe that is responsive to climate change, so a Europe that confronts the pitfalls of anthropocentrism and of Eurocentrism, a, a Europe that is celebrating difference and enriching its understanding of itself through listening to other worlds of meaning and sensing, then the Bauhaus is the wrong name, because the Bauhaus is precisely that tradition, is a monument in the tradition of modernism that is sustained in the anthropocentric principles and in the Eurocentric principles. That, of course, carry other things like patriarchy, sexism, patriarchy, and contemporaneity as defining the moment of the now as being owned by that Europe or by that Eurocentrism. So when we think that the challenges we are facing with climate collapse and enormous social inequality around the globe are the most important challenges for today and for the time to come, then we immediately thought the heritage of the Bauhaus is precisely what needs to be overcome and not what needs to be celebrated or put as a name or as a framework for this initiative. So that is in a nutshell the argument.
I will I will speak a little bit more about why we are so much concerned with names. And a name, as we wrote with Hisham in this article, a name is not just a marketing device. It's not just a tag. A name is a very powerful tool. It is often a semantic monument, especially when you name such an enormous project that will imply billions of millions of euros and the transformation of societies. The name becomes a semantic monument. And this means, in the debate about monuments, for example, this means that a name opens and forecloses possibilities, includes and excludes histories. It is a tool to control imaginaries. So if you monumentalize a name such as the Bauhaus, you are not just celebrating a tradition that has enormous pitfalls in its anthropocentrism and Eurocentrism, but you are also erasing the possibility of validating other ways of doing things. You are erasing the pluralities that lie under that monumental history. And we think the times of monumental history are over. We think we really need to remember our pluralities. And here I'm making a very big contrast between history with a big H, so the history of conservatism, and the remembering that is radical, the remembering of all those possibilities that have been subsumed under the logic of domination. So, in the modern decoloniality framework, or the decolonial framework, we would say that naming is the logic of modernity. It is the control over world historical reality. So when the West colonized the territories around the world, it was land grabbing, yes, but it was also the imposition of a cartography and a naming, the imposition of languages. And this control of naming is what control the representation of the world and the sense of the real. So it is not a small thing. So if you would just conquer to extract profit, which will be only the economic vision, you will miss all the other elements of colonialism that implied the erasure of other knowledges and the erasure of other aestheses, other ways of relating to the world. And we know, and that's why we use the term modernity, because we use it, we are looking at Europe from the outside of Europe. The decolonial framework comes from what Arturo Escobar calls the Latin American critical thought. We are seeing modernity from the outside of Europe. And that's why we see it as a very real thing that came to impose names, to impose systems of knowledge, to impose an aesthetics as if it was universal, as if it was the present of history. And so this epistemic and aesthetic form of control is what established modernity. So we know that modernity is plural and contested within Europe, but the way modernity expressed itself across the world and was experienced is at that as that systemic power that the Bauhaus is also representing. Now we know that that Europe or that modernity, that European project of civilization, that was not all the plural Europes, because the plural Europes, let's say the women that knew about medicine in Europe, didn't come to colonize the Americas, right? The women that, for example, Silvia Federici writes about that are persecuted by the Inquisition in Europe, these plural Europes didn't come to colonize the world. What came to colonize the world is this project of modernity that will expand itself in its modernization impetus. Um, so we know that that project is not just a discourse, but it came with coloniality. The whole project of modernity as a world project of civilization was not possible without the subjugation of the majority of the people of the world. So you cannot account for the history of progress and civilization without the history of enslavement, the history of the plantation, for example. They are co-constitutive, right? It's a very partial vision when you have an idea of modernity as self-created within Europe. This modernity was sustained in global relations that implied ecocide, anthropocentrism, and that imply the subjugation of others through structures of racism, for example. So, so we know that there is no modernity without coloniality. And coloniality is not just colonialism. Coloniality is all that process of erasure and extraction of life that has been sustaining the project of modernity. If we can buy for €1 a chocolate in the supermarket and enjoy it, is because there is a system of global inequality at the service of our enjoyment of life. And this leads me to one of the key questions of the decolonial thought, at least on our side, and is an ethical question. The ethical question says, is as follows: can we live an ethical life in a world in which our well-being and our sense of self is constructed or dependent on the suffering of others and the extraction of earth? Can we live an ethical life in a world in which our well-being is dependent on the suffering of others and the extraction of earth? So can we live an ethical life under modernity? Can we live an ethical life when our sense of self and our enjoyment is dependent on anthropocentrism and the monoculture of the West? So for us, the question of a plural Europe is a question that needs to face this ethical question. Can we continue having an ethical life? Can we actually have an ethical life when our enjoyment is built on these relations, on the destruction of earth and the consumption of the life of others? And this is the structure of colonialism. It changed its name, we call it coloniality, but the plantation in the Caribbean was no other than a system, let's say a microsystem, just to call it micro is not micro at all, but a micro model of this system of globality in which we live today, in which the life of others through racism was expendable, and the life of Earth through monocultures, the destruction of the environment and of ecosystems and the habitat of species, was expendable to create the plantation. And the plantation was an incredible machine for the extraction of life, human and non-human life, for the production of the commodity, the production of the merchandise, the production of profit. So this system is still in place, and we think that that celebrating the background of projects like the Bauhaus that are not disentangled from this project is very problematic, to say the least. I will finally make some remarks on what do we envisage. One of the debates here is, so what is decoloniality? If modernity is built on coloniality, so the imposition of a world order, the world order of modernism, that you have very clearly in Hisham started with Le Corbusier, you have very clearly in these ideas that is, by the way, replicated in the statement of the European Bauhaus, the new Bauhaus, this idea that the good life can be designed, that somebody somewhere through rationality can design the good life for others. And this type of rationality is is something that we are putting into question as one of the things that has become very apparent with for us through the critique of modern aesthetics. When we criticize modern aesthetics, we are not criticizing the beautiful, but we are criticizing who controls the experience of the world, who controls the way we see, the way we sense, the way we taste, the way we enjoy life, and who says what is the good life, who sets the standard of the good life. Like in the discourse of development, we know it very well through the work of Arturo Escobar, for example, it was the American way of life, right? So somebody set a design of a life that is the good life for humanity. So by criticizing aesthetics, we say aesthetics is also part of the modern colonial system, and we need to go beyond its logic, its control over experience, its control over the enunciation of the world, over the designing of life. Now, go back to my previous question, what does it mean to decolonize then? Right? So to decolonize is to understand modernity in its logic of domination, of establishing a world order, a field of experience, an epistemic field, a field of understanding. But we don't stop there. We continue by also recognizing coloniality, and coloniality is something that the Western systems of knowledge have never spoken about, which is to say, what has been erased? What has been the cost of this modernity? It is the cost of the life of Earth and the cost of the life of others and their worlds of meaning and their philosophies and their languages. So the coloniality is concerned with what we call the colonial difference or the colonial wound, because we see that there is no modernity without this loss, without that colonial wound, without erasure. So decoloniality sets up the task of delinking from the modern colonial system. So decoloniality doesn't want to be modern. Decoloniality wants to overcome a system that created a modernity sustained on coloniality. So our task, the decolonial task, is to overcome anthropocentrism and the monoculture of Eurocentrism, of Western centrism, to go towards, as Hisham already mentioned it, towards pluriversality, towards, uh, like the Zapatistas would say, towards a world where many worlds can fit. And that implies an unsilencing. When we speak of naming, we speak of if naming has been a dominant tool to silence other worlds, then the decolonial has to rename, has to unsilence, has to bring to voice those voices and those knowledges that have been discredited. And here is where inclusivity is directly connected to, um, to the climate crisis. We think that there is lot, lots of knowledges in the world that know how to address the relations to Earth in a different way than modernism has done, than the dualist ontology that separates the human from nature. But those voices and those knowledges have been discriminated, have been put aside, have been erased, and in many cases lost. So that's why we think that decoloniality is not a new universal, but is moving towards a pluriversal, towards overcoming the ignorance of a monoculture and moving towards intercultural forms of understanding, towards what somebody like Escobar will name pluriversality, right? And uh, and and that is a world where nobody has anymore the right to decide what is the good life for the world, right? And so it is a world where our mentor and friend Maria Lugones, a very important decolonial feminist that unfortunately passed last year, it's a world of coalitions. It's a world of radical democracy, of engagement. And that's why we said also that this process of contesting the Bauhaus name is not just the contestation of a name, it's a contestation of ways of doing, right? How are we going to open these conversations between that could lead us beyond the paradigm of modernism or modernity? We say, I will finish with this, that decolonizing aesthetics is to liberate aesthesis, so ways of sensing, of living, of experiencing the world that have been subsumed under the power of those that control the experience of the world. So aesthetics is here not just art history or not just the canon of the arts. It is how we have been made as humans that can enjoy the suffering of others and the suffering of earth and create our sense of self out of that. So we think it is the time where this innocence is over and that we really need to face the question of remembering who we are. It is a plea for positionality, for recognizing where are we placed in the world, because we are somewhere in the world. We are not in the abstraction of modernism or postmodernism or performativity. We are somewhere, and this somewhere has responsibilities and has a history. We need to see what have we become when we compare from with other cultures and even with other European legacies. What have we become through colonialism, right? Because of course it is a problem for those that are oppressed and whose territories have been taken and displaced. But this is a question of Toni Morrison. What has the colonizer become? What have we become in this process? We have become something, and as Maria Lugones would say, we might not like it to recognize what we have become, but it is a step to take responsibility, and it is a more truthful position than just placing oneself in the savior position that we will design the world for others, right? Um, so decolonizing aesthetics, decolonizing aesthetics to liberate aesthetics, as also Professor Mignolo has written, um, we say it is a movement from the principle of owning to the principle of owing, a relation to the world that is of ownership and property to one of gratitude and owing. It is moving from the paradigm of representation, where aesthetics and design and modernism has been about representing, designing the world, to a principle of reception. What would it mean to receive the difference of the other instead of trying to design the one world for others? I think this is, at least from our perspective, this is the core of our questioning of the new Bauhaus name. Thank you.
Can I speak now?
Yep. Thank you very much, Rolando. Thank you very much. I would like to take a few questions now, and after which we can take a small break and return. But let's see after the questions. We might not want to have a break and stay here because we are almost 90 people, and to just move 90 people back and forth, maybe that's not a good idea. Is there anyone that would like to pose the first question here? Because I cannot see the hands, so you should help me out here.
Yes, it's also important to remind. Hi everyone, I'm Bruno. I'm the curator and resident liaison of the Jan van Eyck. And in case you want to speak, just write asterisks on the chat and I'll give you the voice, or you can just unmute. Yeah. Since, it's easy.
And just, first of all, I would like to apologize. I made a grave mistake. There have been women that won the Pritzker Prize. So I apologize for that. That is yes. Anne Lacaton in 2021, and the Crafton Architects, and also Sana, I could have known that, which is a duo, and Crafton is also a duo. So I apologize for that. So
good.
If there are no questions right now, I can pose one?
Yes. Let me just tell those watching on Vimeo and YouTube, you can also ask the questions on chat, and then I'll read them out as soon as I can. Okay.
Well, thank you, Rolando, and thank you so much that you have been part of this process all along, and that we have been able to work together on this. And we've been speaking a lot about this project. What do you think that we should do now? How do we move forward if you take this, in fact, very, very grave and deep situation that we are in and that we are faced with? Is it possible to continue working under such an umbrella term, or should we do it otherwise? What would you think? What would you say?
Well, as we have talked about, Hisham, for us it's very clear that it is about the process, about changing the forms we act with each other. So here I will take the principles of decolonial feminism, Maria Lugones again, coalition building, nobody having the right to set a name from one desk for everybody else. And I think the example of what we have been involved with at the formerly called Vite de Vie, that center that is now called Meli Art Institute in Rotterdam, is a very good example of how contesting a name should involve a transformation in governance, a transformation in principles of how institutions are led, and of remaining open to contestation, of remaining, in a way, if we could use the term for institutions, vulnerable and open to contestation, instead of closing down, setting a new master narrative, master discourse, and closing or setting the field for inclusion into my narrative, an inclusion that actually excludes epistemic conversations or interculturality. Right. That says, well, I include you in my territory as long as you are under my system of understanding. Right. Like the contemporary, like the global contemporary, for example.
Exactly. Thank you very much. Is Sophia here? Can we maybe ask Sophia to say a little bit about the process of Meli, or maybe about the name in itself? Maybe she's not here. Okay.
I think she's here.
Yeah?
Yet. No,
she's not here? Okay.
Yet. But we have a question, from Victoria Bardacu. Who is the we and what have we become? Maybe both for you and Rolando.
Okay. Rolando, would you mind?
Yes. So, well, the we is a term that changes meaning as we speak, because sometimes when I'm speaking or we are speaking, I'm using the we, speaking, for example, of the decolonial network of people that are thinking with us, because it's not my knowledge or my thinking, but it's our thinking. But in this question of what have we become, the we, I think, is the global consumer, is to acknowledge what have we become. It's a question of positionality that is an essential methodology for us. coming from Black feminism, and for example, in which my students, I ask them to think about their grandparents and their great grandparents, and then you recognize what have they become. They have the same genetic as their great grandparents, most of them, but still their way of life is completely different. Most of their grandparents, even I teach here in the Netherlands, University of Utrecht, most of their grandparents still knew how to work with the soil and the land and cultivate, and they don't know it anymore. So this question of facing what have they become in this process is very important. I think it is a plea for a positionality that is not in the parameters of identity and performativity, because it is a positionality in time and in relation to the colonial divide. What have I become if my pleasure in life is derived of the suffering of others, for example? Right? In how I dress, in our electronics, in what I have access to eat. And this question of awareness is not geared to produce guilt, it's geared to produce responsibility, to shake, at least in the case of my students, check them out of this ignorance of being just an identity that is designing itself in social media, for example.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. That's another question.
Yes. So there's another question in the chat from Jeroen van den Heijden. Naming is most of the time based on historical references. It is very difficult to name things without these references. Is there, in your opinion, a historical context, pre-colonial, useful to relate to, or do we invent a total new kind of future context?
Yeah, good question. Yeah.
Yes, of course. Sorry, because we are not sitting together. I don't know.
No. And also other people can also address these questions. Okay. I was hoping to have a conversation here. And if others would like to react, then it's possible. Huh? I mean, I have my ideas, you have your ideas. But the idea is here to have a conversation about what this naming means. Huh? The European Bauhaus, I mean, it started with an intuition of mine. And then we built up sort of a small discourse around it, or a small conversation about it, around it. But then still the questions remain, right? What does one do with such a naming? And what other name is there possible? That's the other question. So that's a question mark for me. Rolando?
I think it's really important to recognize that naming is based on historical references. And this is precisely what we are calling for a consciousness of what are those historical references. So for example, I think we will have later on a talk on how the Bauhaus was also implicated in national socialism in Germany. I think Hans Chris will help us with that. And I think it's very important to see what are the historical references of a naming. And it is not a plea to invent something that has not existed. It's a plea to have a name that is historically grounded, and that recognizes its responsibilities. And we say, well, the legacies to which the Bauhaus is connected are not the legacies we think will help us out of climate collapse and social inequality. We think Bauhaus is precisely sitting at the center of the paradigm that we want to overcome. And that historical consciousness is how we're calling it, to shift it, the same as for the Vita de Witt name that was central to the history of Dutch colonialism. And those names we think are untenable today, but there is a host of other names that we might want to bring as the umbrella terms for opening other conversations that will also be historically grounded. Right? I mean, we have to remember that Europe has been plural, and even it had this dominant narrative coming through the Renaissance and the Enlightenment. Europe has been plural, and its plurality has also been subsumed under these dominant narratives. So there are many possibilities of names, So I think what Hisham said at the introduction, we are not really, is not an anti-European statement to criticize the Bauhaus. It is an anti-Eurocentrist or modernist statement, and for a plural Europe, right?
Mm-hmm. Maybe we can take some of the people in that might want to also speak about their why they undersigned the letter or contested basically the naming. Can I give the floor to some of you? Like
Malkit has a question.
A question. Okay, let's have Malkit. Malkit, would you mind saying something? And maybe
sure.
if you can briefly state who you are and what you do, just in one sentence, if it's possible.
Hi everyone. My name is Malkit Shoshan, and I'm originally from Israel. I don't live there anymore, and I'm the director of a small foundation that is based in New York and works in Amsterdam, that look at that develops projects at the intersection of architecture, urban planning, and human rights. And I'm currently directing a master's program at the Harvard Graduate School of Design called Art Design and the Public Domain. So Hisham and Rolando, thank you very much for the initiative and this presentation. For me, it's also very personal, because I feel like I've lost so much because of modernity. My mom never spoke to me with her mother tongue, you know. It was always, I'm coming from a culture and a country that have been, that devised modernity to whitewash an entire, let's say, country and construct a nation state and national identity, etc. So actually my question to you is, modernity led to internal and external erasures within Europe and outside of Europe, and to what extent you are working toward expanding this coalition. I'm less interested in the name itself, but I think the idea of plurality and extending this coalition toward all these voices that have been lost, how you trace them, how you bring them into this conversation. That's it.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Malkit. Yeah, very good question. And it's going to seem now that all of those questions are going to be directed to us, right? So we would then find the answers for it. I think this has been one of the questions also towards the European Commission, as they vow for systemic change, they vow for broad engagement. And also they have set up, and maybe Vera can say something about that, a system in which they harness and gather information and also ideas from let's say, a broad selection of people. It's open for everyone to add ideas within the design phase of the new European Bauhaus, which is ending July. So this idea of broad engagement can be seen as opening up, let's say, a platform in which then people can add their ideas. Also us, we can add our ideas. We can start a network right now and add this equation, let's say, of thinking maybe in a decolonial way about the new European Bauhaus project. That could be a project that we can add to the design phase of the new European Bauhaus. That could be something. Yeah, so the question still remains, and it's very difficult. Now we are almost like 90 people together. How do you form a coalition or a gathering of a multitude of people from different backgrounds, with different languages, with different viewpoints, from different layers of society together, and form this coalition that we are talking about? Should they be different coalitions? Should they be different networks? Where do they come together? So that's actually, that's a question, in fact, that we should put center. How do we get together? How do we form this discussion? So I would say that's part of actually designing this. At first, when we started this, we said, well, why don't we design the table together first, and then we sit at it, you know, so, something like that. Yeah, as you know, yeah. So that's a question. Rolando, would you mind? Or anyone else?
Yes, I think the idea of this initiative, of this conference, is that we will launch a series of forums that I think, in our understanding, they need to be place-based.
They need to be in localities with very particular problematics and interests. For example, in the Netherlands, we have a very strong movement for decolonizing the university that I'm very much looking forward to bring those voices into this debate. So the idea is that in the next period, there will be forums organized in different localities, and then we will come back together to gather those voices and see how we can respond better to this initiative or contribute to it. So it is, for us, the basis is a participative project.
Mm-hmm.
That is how we should operate, instead of designing from the top a framework that we would be reproducing the problem we are questioning, basically.
Yeah.
So we think it should be also uncovering other forms of governance, of participation,
Yeah.
of including those voices that are not included in current institutions. And I think this is the great challenge, overcoming the Bauhaus that serves as a big metaphor for us of that modernism, is also to overcome these forms of governance and these forms of aesthetics and of education. So we say, let me just add very quickly three things. When we work with Professor Gloria Becker on decolonizing Amsterdam University, the diversity report, we need to change who is participating in which spaces. So who is the curator, who is the director, who is tending to the services of the arts institutions, for example, in this case, who is collecting, etc. And then we need to address the what. So what is the curriculum, the content, which voices are being expressed, which frameworks of understanding, more deeply which ontologies. Are we moving towards relational ontologies that are the ontologies that have been endangered by the dualist ontologies of modernity, like Arthur Escobar shows? And so that's the what. And the how. We need to change how we do things. We cannot just change the content and the people and keep on reproducing the structures that, for example, are patriarchal or are racist. Even, I mean, we had in the university cases of racism, even with content that is non-racist. So we really need to change the three levels, the who, the what, and the how. So questioning the Bauhaus, it is an important thing, the name, but it is an important thing because it carries a politics and an ethics, and we are concerned with how to move beyond that politics and that ethics.
Yeah, and I would like to add to that we do want to write a proposal, and I added within a design phase, also to make use also of this opportunity that there is. So I think in fact. It's not only about the naming. It's if we want to find different structures, different kinds of gathering, different kinds of thinking, different kinds of approach in this world, then we must also find new ways, and that's basically the question. So, but it needs to be, in the end, it needs to come back as a project or as a proposal that we can lay down on the table, and then we can move forward long term. But maybe other people have ideas on that, because that's exactly why we are here together as well. Because we have undersigned, 450 people undersigned the letter, stating that they kind of agree or back the idea of overcoming the name. And then what is the next step? So maybe can I give one of the people, like for instance Lisbeth and Jos Bik van der Pol, would you mind saying something why you backed the objection and how you would see this project moving forward? Is that a possibility for you to do that in a few minutes?
We prepared something because we thought we were asked to prepare something.
Exactly.
So maybe what we will talk about is also the dilemma with this. No, we undersigned the letter, and I'm still fully behind it. And at the same time, I'm also wondering, or we are also wondering how, and maybe Rolando already pointed out, how and what and who. No, so it's. Can I read from? What
Yes,
we
please do so. Yeah, and then shall we just say we skipped a break because I just want to get the energy going and the speed going because that's better. Okay.
So I will read from paper, which is maybe a little bit boring, but otherwise we will lose concentration and track of our own thoughts. So thinking about this evening and thinking about the letter and also the essay in Recto Verso by Hisham and Rolando, we were starting again. What is it? What is it that we are talking about? So the question, what's in a name? What do we want from the Bauhaus initiative? And I mean the new Bauhaus, the new European Bauhaus, and where should it lead to? So those were the starting questions of what we were thinking. Then we were referring also, thinking back of the name of the New Deal. The New Deal is being used over and over again. It becomes the New Green Deal, it becomes the New Creative Deal, and there's probably many more deals that I don't know about. But the New Deal was not in all of its phases in the original, let's say, program in the 30s, a radically redistributive program, nor one that sought to challenge fundamentally the institution of American capitalism, or global capitalism, if you wish. The New Deal stands for a motivating myth, more for a motivating myth than for a concrete program. So its strength is in the narrative. The New Deal, the New Green Deal, for example, shares little with the New Deal beyond its name and willingness to use the machinery of the state to engineer a just society. The Brazilian climate change expert Antonio Donato Nobri plays a relevant role in the dissemination and popularization of science. He's a researcher at the National Institute for Amazon Research, and he pointed towards the importance of narration. So I'm going a little bit off to a different track now, perhaps. Anyway. Mm-hmm. During the project that we developed for the 31st Biennial of Sao Paulo, he introduced the collapse of environmental ecosystems and the need to touch on people's senses in such a way that they understand what this collapse means. He sees a fundamental role for imagination as a conducting line in storytelling and arts, and as this boosts awareness about the wholeness of the living environment, a sense of wonder with the privilege of being alive, and the ability to grasp that condition. Together with Jared Moss, a Swiss-Brazilian pilot, engineer, public speaker, educator, environmentalist, and explorer, he witnessed firsthand how human interference was and is having a negative impact, to say the least, on forests, lakes, rivers, and oceans. Having perceived how our quality of life and our very survival is totally interconnected with nature, they see the sense of urgency in communicating to the public how important it is to preserve the rainforest. Questions are, for example, how to connect the perception of our environmental condition with intimate flows of motivation emotions. Is there art in the functional crafts and systems of nature? We are now in the middle of a global crisis, or maybe we have always been in the middle of a global crisis, that exposes the failure of systems. The climate crisis is a direct result of this system error, and we need all the time we have to force ourselves towards a social and mental reset. This is a project about the future of truth, perhaps, but what is truth anyway? And whose truth are we talking about? We are living through a crisis of understanding and accepting what is true and what is not. It becomes clear that we cannot afford to ignore how knowledge is formed and distorted. So when or how should we trust what others tell us? In our current political landscape, we disagree not just over values and not just over facts, but also about how to determine what these facts are and who speaks, who decides, and who listens. Democracies are especially vulnerable because it needs the deliberative participation of their citizens, so they must place a special value on truth, plural. Now what to do? Ursula von der Leyen has proposed to commission 5 projects, as you stated yourself in the Recto Verso essay, in 5 different EU countries to be decided by participatory and open forms of governance. Our question would be, why only 5 commissions? Does a sustainable near future for the world not include everyone? And if we are to start at the EU, then why not 27 Commission projects at least? Or why not more? Why not 100? Why not 1,000? Why not projects all over the world? Why not thinking tables, etc., all over the world with maybe specific emphasis? Everything that has been said about Bauhaus, about how what started as a utopian project has become the modernist project, rolled out as a military operation over the world, is true, and also not the whole story, perhaps. Yes, we do want horizontal structures, civic assemblies, and round tables. However, our dilemma is as well, do we have time to rename the European New Bauhaus? As IPPC convincingly argues, the clock is ticking and we have less than 10 years to adjust our course. Well, probably naming will not take 10 years, but anyway. And our behavior to stay under the 1.5 degrees warming. So we suggest to actively think of a response to climate collapse that addresses social equality and any forms of discrimination, and to embrace also the uncomfortability, perhaps, with the name. And to use the name, perhaps, as a, how do you say that? In Dutch, we have this name, geuzennaam, which is also, probably, or whatever, nickname, continually, by using it as a nickname, continually reminding us, let's say, of the criticality and uncomfortability that is in that name. But perhaps I'm wrong, because I was also part of the Mali transfer, let's say. So we suggest to actively think of a response to climate collapse that addresses social inequality and any forms of discrimination, and I said that already, to embrace this uncomfortability. We need to embark on a process of listening and participation and go straight to the urgent matters. We need to involve and engage everyone and create a narrative that makes truth accessible and acceptable. Then maybe we can create transformative movement for an environmentally sustainable, plural and socially just Europe and world. So no more diversions, we would say. We need to collaborate, cross-pollinate in all the polyphonic voices that we are. And this starts now.
Shall we take a question? From,
yes.
Yeah.
Maybe to add to what Lisbeth has just laid out, there's a comment question from Sander Nielsen in the chat. Isn't there a huge discrepancy between allowance of diversity and implied central mechanism that ensures that allowance? And then Jane Bateson also put something else on the table in terms of this allowance of diversity. How can we develop a more inclusive dimension of language to establish interactions through design to realize, among others, behavioral change and bridge the gap between saying and doing? Mm-hmm. And then later on, we'll give Katia Garcia-Anton the word, also if she wants to ask a question, but maybe you want to...
Yeah, what I think would be great if we are recording this, and what I would like to do is to use this as a basis to work on and to see this as a project. These questions could lay the basis of a thinking towards, let's say, a more inclusive approach relating to the new European Bauhaus project. So I would say we note the questions. These are broad questions that are difficult to answer, that needs to be answered by all of us, and I think we should use this as part of the project. Mm-hmm. So maybe we can go to the next. Or Sandra, would you like to add to that? Because Sandra, I can see only a few screens. Sandra, would you like to add to that, or would you like to have an answer, or is it for you okay that we say we note it and we keep it as part of the process? What do you say?
Oh, Hicham, I'm happy that it's part of the process. Okay. It's something I keep noticing in everything that's being discussed. We seem to want to have plurality at the same time as we need to get all the noses pointed in the same direction.
Exactly. Yeah, which is kind of a, yeah.
It's very contradictory. I often think of my work in Indonesia and I think of rewilding, just let it be. But at the same time with rewilding, we know sometimes we have to remove the topsoil, or we have to create mechanisms whereby the soil can absorb water again. Exactly. I know that the biological analogy doesn't always fit, but there is definitely some kind of centrality desired in a new way of thinking at the same time as we want to accept pluralism, and it's
Exactly.
great.
Exactly. Maybe
Maybe I
Rolando
can add
would.
something.
Yeah,
Yes.
please. Yeah.
Just very briefly, I think when we are faced with the structures of power that create dichotomies worldwide, like the dichotomy of gender, dichotomies of race, dichotomy human nature, there needs to be responses that undo those mechanisms. So there are some struggles that need to deal with the big structures. So plurality, the plural worlds have been very vulnerable towards the structures of power. So the suggestion we have made is the process of humbling. So we call for the humbling of modernity. So a modernity that recognizes how it is not just producing a future, but that it is implicated in the problems of the world. And so there is, for example, changing the university, changing the museum, also, for example, the work that Charles Esche is doing is very important because these institutions are reproducing global inequalities. So plurality is there, but there are structures that undermine plurality. And those structures we are responsible for, and we need to undo them. We need to make them responsible. We need to call them to question. And this is the process of the humbling. And so that's, I think, one of the things. And I think one of the ways we have dealt with this other question of language and the bridging between saying and doing is precisely the politics of listening, what we have called listening as critique. Because then you are not separated in the doing and the saying, but you are responsible for listening what goes beyond your frameworks of understanding. So listening across the colonial difference, not just listening to yourself or to your own Eurocentric narrative. So the colonial listening is to listen beyond the frameworks of understanding. So it implies the humbling and the listening. And that listening, in a way, is a verbality, is an action. It's not just saying separated from doing. Listening is in itself an action that we think can lead to transformation. So in a way, what we are saying by criticizing the Bauhaus is we are calling on a big institution that is the European Commission to listen, to not just determine what others have to do under those umbrellas, but how can we bring it to listen to all those voices that are not in those corridors. And of course, it's a big challenge, and I think we will always have partial victories if we have any at all. But,
And what happens if we add the aspect of time to it? Rolando, would you say? If the frame or the window that we have is narrow and the time frame that we have is narrow, as the question also has in it, is there time to listen? Maybe Sandra, you would be hinting at maybe we do need a project that is pushing forward a kind of narrative because it just goes faster, but it would be unequal as well. Rolando, do you have any? How does time work in that?
Well, here it's a very complex question. One is that we are faced with a mechanistic chronology that is the destruction of the planet. Right? The project of modernity is facing its ecological limits, and climate collapse is the consequence of its logic of progress on the back of exploiting Earth and exploiting others. So that has an end road, right? So we are in that chronology, but we think that the response to that has to do with other temporalities, with how people relate to Earth. So the last resources in the planet are in the hands of people that relates to Earth in a very different way, not as a resource, but as that. So Earth as time, Earth as that space that sustains life, and that we need to tend to and to care about, and not just create it into an object of our design. of the world, into a garden or into a mine. But so the response to that end chronology, that is a kind of catastrophic temporality, is the recovery of what we call relational temporalities. I think this is listening to other ontologies, right, that are saying, no, we need to relate. Well, I mean, this is a question that we listen from the First Nations from around the world. How can you think that you're more human and more developed the more you consume the earth? It's completely absurd for most First Nation cultures that have preserved their ecosystems, right? Because for them to be more human, more developed is that relation, that deep relation. So, and this is not essentialism, it's a very clear question. So who is the barbarian in a story of somebody that is finishing its own habitat through the logic of modernization, or those that are devoted to a non-anthropocentric position where they understand the relation to Earth that in a very different way, in a way in which we could understand it, in which we could just realize that our whole body comes from the Earth, but we have lost that memory somewhere in this human dream, in this utopia of modernism, let's call it like that for the moment. Yeah. But it's a bit absurd if you think it like that. How can we think we are more developed the more we destroy the Earth? And this is the vision of a lot of First Nation thinkers around the world that we don't learn in our universities because we don't consider them thinkers or philosophers, right? But they are very important thinkers and philosophers. And their knowledge is questioning very deeply the parameters of our model of civilization.
Thank you. Thank you. Should we take Katja?
Yes. Yeah. Maybe we can give the word to Katia Garcia Anton. Katia, would you like to ask your question now? I have the feeling it might be related to what Rolando just said. Let's see.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Can you see?
Yeah, great.
Okay,
Got you there.
Great. Hi, everybody. And hi, Rolando. Hi, Hisham. Hi, Bruno. Nice to see you all. I'm not sure if mine is a question or like an observation. And I wanted to say I'm in Oslo, in Norway. I work for the Office of Contemporary Arts, and part of my work has been very closely linked to the Sami communities, so the indigenous people of the Fennoscandic region that goes from Norway through Sweden, Finland, and Russia. And I wanted to bring up what Malkid said earlier. I thought it was very important when she talked about internal erasure and external erasure. And when thinking about Europe, one of the internal erasures that has happened and continues to happen is the internal erasure of Sapmi, of the indigenous communities of this part of Europe. And those are, those are the result. That's the result of policies, economic policies that alienate their perspectives on life and their ways of being and living and thinking, legal policies that punished their ability to protest with such overwhelming tools that squash their voice, educational policies, health policies, linguistic policies, all of these are not things of the past. They're things that absolutely continue today and in the art world too. So the art world is completely implicated in all of this. But I wanted to take that point further, and perhaps this is a little bit where the question might be, because I'm not sure how aware people are in Europe of the direct role, the direct contribution that many countries in Europe are making to continue these policies, to strengthen these policies in the Fennoscandic region, in these countries, in Norway, Sweden, and Finland, and Russia. And just to give you an idea, Norway is presenting itself to the world, and also much of its economic revenue in the world is coming from being a so-called green energy provider. But that so-called green energy is coming at the cost of indigenous ways of living and being. And many of those windmill farms that are being built in Norway as we speak are projects which are owned by Germany or by Switzerland. So when thinking about this project, I think it would be very important to think about the direct implication that many of these countries have in erasing indigenous perspectives and in erasing that knowledge, which, as all of you said, and Rolando also, those knowledges are so intimately connected to a guardianship perspective on the world, and those are knowledges that can really help us to think in more important ways about climate urgency and climate emergency. So yes, I think that's the point I wanted to make.
Thank you so much, Katja. Thank you. Do we have another question, or can I?
You can elaborate.
Can I maybe give the word to Charles Ash? Maybe would you mind saying something, and maybe you can also relate it to your ideas of demodernism, etc. Thank you very much.
Demodernizing, maybe. Verbs, not isms. But I think, gosh, it's a bit dark. So now I'll turn the light on. Sorry. Where has it got so dark? Yeah, I had prepared a little bit, but I think maybe I think Rolando's talk was really beautiful as often, and I think it's very important to take cognizance of what he says in relationship to this naming, but also I think there's no urgency. I think in the process up to July, and hopefully the process beyond that, I think we need to understand the name as something provisional, something that needs to be part of the design, and indeed going forward with the design names. I was thinking in terms of, obviously you go through a sort of process when something like that comes to you about thinking, well, what could the name be? And, everything that I came up with, the best I came up with was to name it after Aimé Césaire, maybe. But I think that also has its problems, actually, in terms of, again, the positionality of that, also necessarily excluding other kinds of geographies in Asia, for instance, which would not be included. And it's rather like the sort of battle of the statues that we have in many, particularly Anglo-Saxon countries, but also here now, in which statues should be removed or not. I mean, the problem is that statues to individuals who are necessarily flawed and necessarily problematic is actually the problem. We shouldn't really have statues to any individuals. We should have statues to something which is more inclusive, to collectives, to people that work together, in which those flaws are compensated for by other humans, because even the individual statue, whoever is the hero, is part of the problem that modernity has left us with as it departs, I think. So naming maybe is something that we need to walk through, but naming it the Bauhaus, I think, really brings to the foreground the problematics of this historical referencing of a modernity that we need to escape from, or we need to reject, simply because I suppose one of the most powerful namings that has been done in a positive sense, I think, since the Second World War is the idea of never again. And it's never again although its power is only now waning, really. It's only now in the last 10 years or so really waning. For a long time it kept the forces of fascism at bay. And I think we should be grateful for that fact, that it's kept them at bay for so long. But part of its failure really was to so specifically mention the Holocaust and the National Socialist period in Germany as the never again which we were rejecting. Because if that never again had been connected, and that's partly a fault in the design of the European Union, not to take history and education as part of its responsibilities, at least to add to national and local and hyper-local stories. But to have a dimension in which the question of colonialism could have been the subject of never again. And if that had been shaped, and that the exceptional nature of National Socialism was also seen in relationship, as indeed Aimé Césaire very beautifully wrote about, in relationship to colonialism and the mindsets of colonialism, then we would be further. So I mean, maybe we could call it the new never again, might be a more appropriate name to some extent, at least to start to try and renew that in a way, pact with ourselves, that promise with ourselves, to if we start moving in that direction, which is obviously the direction now 20% of the Dutch voters in the last election voted brown, essentially. So we have to see that movement is happening again, and in order to avoid that, I think we need a kind of an instruction, an imperative to say that that's not possible, and it's something that the European Union, I think, is invested in. I don't think the European Union is at all invested in the fascist right or the populist right or the radical right or whatever we call it. So I think that's one point, is that names should understand, one of the attempts we should make in July is to make the Bauhaus, the new European Bauhaus, in inverted commas and provisional. And if another name emerges, then that name could emerge. But there are two other points I'd like to make quickly, which is that, as I understand it, around these 5 projects located in 5 nation states within the EU, I think that's rather problematic. And it's problematic because I think what we need is to build an institutional infrastructure at the European level which crosses over national boundaries. And I think that one of the demands for this program should be that it works institutionally. I mean, one of the good examples of maybe from the Bauhaus is the fact that it was an institution rather than an individual, so therefore it implies a collective. And that the program should also address itself to collectives, which are often organized in institutions of very different scales and different purposes. So from smaller artist-run organizations in my field, in the artistic field, to museums, but also in other fields that equal scale, that possibility of disagreement, that shift of geographies and of positionalities that Rolando talks so nicely about, that needs to be included in these packages. And I don't think they should be located anywhere in that sense. I mean, given Corona and given the conversations like this, location is actually, has been strangely displaced from the agenda at the moment. And maybe we both need to be located in where we are, but not necessarily feel as though power needs to be centralized in a particular location in these relationships. So I think that needs to be rethought if we're designing it. And the other thing that I would plead for, and this comes also from my experience with Internationale, which is a museum confederation, which has a program called Our Many Europes, actually, which I don't think is such a bad name in some ways, running with support of the European Union. But it is that I think that the focus of the program should be about repurposing the existing institutions and not creating new institutions. I don't think, we might have a problem with European and Bauhaus, but we should also perhaps have a problem with new, because I think we are moving into a phase of degrowth. And I think that we need to repurpose what we have. So I think that it would be far more effective if the program was targeted at repurposing existing institutions by stopping them doing some of the things that they're doing through encouragement of money, rather than authoritarian means, but nevertheless through stopping them to do currently what they're doing in order to repurpose their activities in the line with what we call this Green New Deal, but essentially in response to the climate crisis. And I think Jan van Eyck and what Hicham has done, I want to give very much praise to what he's done over the last 2 years in bringing the whole organization into line with that question. That was a significant change, and it stopped doing some of the things that it had done in the past. And that move, I think, is something that the European Union, if it is to be effective, should contribute to.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Charles. Do we have questions maybe that we can
You wanted to, there's Hans de Christ that just raised a hand. Maybe we can give him the word.
Yeah, exactly. I just there's still this question, because what you're saying basically, Charles, as well, is that it would move through institutions, but how can we forge a broader engagement with people that are not connected to those institutions? How would we make them part of it? Is there any idea that you have with that? Is that through programming, for instance?
No, I mean, I think it's important that you understand the ecosystem of that institutional engagement to be from the very small scale to the much larger scale. And you understand the relationships between, within Internationale, we're working with the Institute of Radical Imagination, which is a sort of grassroots organization, and with Reina Sofia. And that I think people can find a way of self-institutionalizing or putting themselves in organizations, in collectives. And I'm more interested, I have to say, than the sort of maverick individual, which is trained in the art school to be the genius of modernist mythology. If they are excluded, I'm less bothered, I have to say. But what I am interested in is young people, old people, people with all sorts of potential that can find themselves being able to group themselves together, those people being given a voice. So I think the institution has to be understood in quite a wide way, but I think that the institutional collaboration, which then, as a result of it developing its own collaboration, receives European funding because it shows that it is capable of working at these different scales, at the scale of the very local, at the scale of the organization. If I look out my window, there's an organization for migrant people who've been uitgeprocedeerd, processed through the asylum system and come out the other side without a right of staying, and I look down on that, and they're involved in what we're doing in the Bernaba, for instance. That's a micro level organization working with a bigger organization. It's very possible. It needs listening, and it needs adjusting what the bigger institutions particularly do, and often it needs the bigger institutions to simply say yes to things, and not try to control, and not try to bully, and not try to shape. Not try to design a good life. But nevertheless, the platforms that we have as a sort of middle-sized institution like Bernaba is something that can be valuable for
Exactly. Thank you so much. Can I give the word to Hans? Thank you so much for being here, Hans.
Thank you for the invitation. And maybe also to Charles, I think we should get as quick as possible rid of the term of Bauhaus. I mentioned that also in the email, in the communication before the conference, that at least when you looking into this marketing show of the Bauhaus, which was already on stage in the 20s. So we don't speaking about the reinvention by the Cold War, the fascination by Taylorism and Fordism by Walter Gropius after the first 3 years. This very strange formation between art and technology, and to create by the art a mystification of technology, to naturalize the technology. And at the, also in the way how they were looking at the working class, as developing an idea of quality which only means to minimize the standard of quality for the people who have to live in their housings. The immediately transformation in which all the big names we know, from Gropius to Mies van der Rohe, Joost Schmidt, Lili Reich, especially Herbert Bayer, into the propaganda system of the Third Reich, of the fascist system. Because their competences were needed. The aspect that they were one of the students of the Bauhaus was an architect of Auschwitz-Birkenau. That Ernst Neufert was in the department for Albert Speer in the war industry. And how all these people reappeared with the second wave of imperialism along magazines like Fortune, along new propaganda exhibitions in the US. So when I heard this speech of van der Leyen and heard the title, The New Bauhaus, I didn't know if I should laugh or cry. So I guess there's a very strong need. But also when I describe that in this way, then also what is sharpening inside of this is also what is here the critique on modernity, and what are the possible bifurcations inside of this modernity which became invisible. So this is now following very much also a little bit with the talk. This erasing of other possibilities, this erasing of other knowledges is very strong mirrored and give us a hint and a support to see what we can not longer see by the condition of a modernity, which is simply basically sought out of the formation of colonialism. So for me, it's quite interesting how we now also under this moment where now the European Commission is coming up with this idea of the new Green Deal. And of course, when we're speaking about the New Deal, this is again another story, but giving this a name, New Bauhaus, they are immediately in this trap of repeating. So also to say never again means from this perspective that we said that so often, so endlessly, that maybe a better title would be European Union, the new province. So more like Chakrabarti would say to provincialize Europe in this concept. This would also then immediately mean that we, in all the infrastructures of the institutions which we have nowadays in Europe, we have to be very careful to use a term, at one example, when we say something like curriculum. Who is putting a curriculum together? Out of which perspectives? Because in the moment when we have a curriculum, we are in a mirror relationship of power structures. So this is incredibly complicated. This means also that we have to create different temporalities. So that when we only argue with the term of the urgency, then we're losing absolutely the possibilities of finding moments where we can identify these forms of bifurcations. And then I'm very, very much with you, Charles, when you said maybe we have to skip the term new, and we can look inside of the institutions not so much as discursive platforms, but as infrastructures. Because there are a lot of activities in the moment. There's from also in Europe, from a very young generation, there are activities, and they dealing with this urgency, but they also develop their strategies. And what's happened now, step by step in Stuttgart, is that they recognize our art institution as an infrastructure. But we don't connect that, at one example, with the question of design, art, or architecture. They simply take it in use. So far as a comment on.
Okay. Thank you so much, Hans. Thank you. Would you mind stating where you work, and maybe so people have a context? Yeah.
We are running an art institution, Württembergische Kunstverein, is very, very complicated to pronounce for non-German speakers in Stuttgart, in the rich southwest of Germany.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. Yeah. Can I give the word now to Sofia Hernandez, who might be able to tell us a little bit how this transition of the naming of Witte de Wit went to Melli? You had to go through a whole process, and also Rolando was part of that process, and that's also interesting. Might you want to relate to that a little bit, also in the context of what we are talking about now, the new European Bauhaus? Hi, Sofia. Thank you for being here. Hi.
Thank you, Hisham, and all the team for sending information and organizing this conference, for the team of the Jan van Eyck, and of course for initiating the call with a letter that you invited us to sign. It's the end of the day, so I'm not
You look very good, Sofia.
So I have been listening, and I'm very happy to speak just briefly about the experience of the changing of the name at Kunstinstitut Melli from what it was, Witte de Wit Center for Contemporary Art. But I wanted to comment a couple of things that have been said, and that of course relates to the naming of the New European Bauhaus. And I've taken some notes. I didn't write much, but just from listening, I took some notes. And I think that one of the things that I take from the letter, or rather from the essay authored by Hisham and by Rolando, is their proposal that climate change is one of a transnational character and not just specifically of a given region. And so what you question is that the name of this cultural hub is not one that should be specific to a place, say Europe, or to an ideology, which is what is being debated here as modernity or modernism. As it pertains that, I think that it's clear that what is being proposed is that it is an architectural building that serves as an example of collaborative practice and as an example of where we can go with zero carbon emissions. But the Bauhaus, to me, regardless of the fact that we're contending here of its European roots, the Bauhaus is ultimately not exactly just an architecture, or not just meaning as a building or representative of a style, modernity, or functionalism, and not also just associated to a kind of cross-pollination between disciplines. It's more than anything, I would say, a school. And for me, the proposal that is being presented by the Green Deal, the New European Green Deal, is not one that thinks about this collaborative effort or architecture as a school for learning or as a place for learning. And I think that is something that one could rescue from an idea of the Bauhaus without using the name, but instead focusing precisely on a space for convening people from different backgrounds, in this case, from different disciplines, and to do so in a space or environment for learning. Mm-hmm. And for me, that's actually quite important, because the Bauhaus is not just the only example, whether in Europe or elsewhere, that has been such a strong and groundbreaking space of learning that has multiple repercussions internationally. And I think that one thing to remind ourselves is that perhaps the strongest power of the Bauhaus was not just that place in and of itself in Germany, but instead the diaspora of the Bauhaus that actually installed itself across the world, and that was not exactly extractivist, but instead was one that set root, created seeds, created other schools elsewhere, whether that was Chicago or ideas of that school, say in Mexico, wherever you wanted, because in reality, it was the professors and the artists at that actually created new seeds for spaces of learning that they had been inspired originally from the Bauhaus. So I do think that the questioning of the naming, if it is to imply such an experiment of forward-thinking or cross-disciplinary activity, then it should really focus on two things: on creating spaces for learning that are certainly collaborative, as they say, and also to think about the impact of diaspora, immigration, and people's movement. And I think that Europe, if we think of it right now, the diversity or the super diversity that many cities have, such as Rotterdam, in the urban lingo, it is called ultimately a super diversity, or that's the lingo of the urban planners. It is precisely because of the extractivism that has happened from European countries elsewhere that ultimately may become green in this region, but are polluting other continents. So I think that it's very important to think about colonialism or decolonizing, not only of the institutions here, but of what being clean here implies being contaminated elsewhere. So I think that that's to begin, and which is ultimately contradictory to how the diaspora of the many diasporas that the Bauhaus created elsewhere in thought and in structures, thought through and felt for. So that's on the one hand. The other question, of course, that regards the letter is that the idea of modernity that is being debated as thinking that the Bauhaus sort of creates a kind of modernity is the one thing to be questioned, because as many other thinkers have proposed, thinkers outside of Europe, is that there are many modernisms as there have been many conceptualisms. And I think that it's very closed when you think of the Bauhaus and its own modernity. It just doesn't allow, and I'm playing here the devil's advocate as it pertains modernity in regards to the very response from Hisham and Rolando. Now, I think that it's quite interesting also what has been also explained in terms of Big van der Poel's, Elizabeth's presentation, and Charles, and right now of Hans, about understanding relations, about thinking about the effectivity of these plans. I would like to mention here that the thing that is missing is from this discussion around culture, meaning what the project of the new Bauhaus presents is the importance of culture in changing a mindset, particularly through the exhibitionary complex, meaning it pretends to express in its very architecture a kind of feeling of and project of that is in favor of counteracting the climate change. My question around that is, from what has been said here, is that we also think of Europe as or this region that is being sort of associated as a continent that moves forward with the proposal, is that this is an all so-called developed region. When even if you think about what we're living today, this happens to be the longest new world that there is. I mean, how is it possible right now that so many other continents have advanced much more rapidly and effectively in vaccination against corona? How is it possible that that the lockdowns and the associated economics, health, and mental stability has been understood differently and perhaps in much more advanced ways elsewhere? So there's a number of things that I kind of feel that the idea of progress and advancement that this proposal is presenting seems not to think that there are many other developed regions elsewhere, as that there are many undeveloped regions within Europe. So that brings me again to the question around migration, precisely because that is the focus that Rolando and Hisham make in their letter, is that the name is not inclusive. And my question is that it's not only not inclusive of the transnationalism that a project like climate change proposes or adheres to, but also it's not inclusive to thinking that that a so-called new Bauhaus, or whatever's name it will come to be, if it's not that it really looks at at all the other forms of intelligence and forms of knowledge that is brewing and shared and being articulated within Europe by the very more recent immigrant communities that have come to form part of the continent's own diverse culture. So the curator from the Office of Norway, I can't remember.
The director of OCA, yeah.
Whose name, who presented, but whose name I don't recall because I didn't take note of that.
Katja Anton.
Katja, yeah.
Katja, yeah.
She already presented the indigenous knowledge that in her own country here in the Baltics is palpable and being addressed currently in contemporary thinking. So again, there are many modernities, there are many different forms of knowledge, whether it's modernism or the more sustainable, in fact, indigenous knowledge that has been giving us a lot of lessons as of late in forms of undoing our own thinking. So as it pertains the name change and my experience, I would just briefly say that it's certainly, that Rolando Vazquez is certainly very right, that the bridge between saying and doing is in fact listening, deep listening or critical listening or listening critically is really difficult. It means that you can disagree but still allow. And I really think that that's very difficult. And at the same time, it presents the proposal that that is counter-populist, see? Meaning if populism is about saying, maybe doing, what the politics of listening present is to really, not become shy, but step back and hear not what is being told, but what is not being said, and that is ultimately between the lines. So it's not just hearing about the anxieties of communities, but trying to really locate where these anxieties are stemming from. Hearing in Rotterdam, I don't know Dutch, unfortunately. I mean, I've really been studying, but it's very difficult. But I Google Translate the news, and there's a lot of news about the very fact that within the country itself, and Hisham may know better and can speak of that, it is very farmers that are not exactly interested in changing the food for the cows, or in changing the amount of cows per plot of land. And the scientific facts that have shown already that it is these ranches that are the ones that are exuding more carbon emissions. So great collaborative school where we can all learn through the expression of architecture about how we can actually sort of help out to address climate change in more positive ways and lower the emissions. But my question is whether it's really architecture and a collaborative setting that manifests all the engineering and the industry is advancements as it is presented there, or if it's really a culture of learning, which is what the new European Green Deal has to focus on. I am very lucky to have landed, not in an institution that had to change the name, by the way, but certainly in an institution that built itself in a building that was originally constructed to be a school in the 19th century. And for me, the fact that the building was designed to be a school, it has what has really created much of the language and the inspiration and the frameworks for designing a process for a name change. And so my proposal to Hisham's and Rolando's arguments to the European Commission is to really think about the context of the Bauhaus, not because of its name or because of architecture or because of being so-called forward thinking, but because it really was a space of learning that generated diasporas that replicated spaces of learning elsewhere. And in fact, they were not modern at all. So that's what I would like to say. And changing a name is very difficult, by the way. And everyone thinks that you just choose it and change it like that. In this case, since it's a new project, maybe it's easier. And I think that it's very timely that the letter and that the motion from Hisham, the Jan van Eyck and his collaborators was sent out, because it is really at the start of a project where these meanings or the possible meanings of a name can be tested and worked out so that they are in fact more inclusive, or at least much more imaginative. And I think that would be my thinking.
Thank you so much, Sophia. And may I congratulate you with what you've done with Melly. I mean, you have collaborated, you have gone through the pain, you have taken also your time, which it took you 2 or 3 years to go from Witte de Wit to Kunstinstituut Melly. And I really admire it if I see how you sort of transfer maybe this kind of international art thinking through the local, where the local has gained a much better and a much more profound stage at your institution. And I find that fantastic to see that. So that could be a good example also for us. Also, this process.
I think that the core example that Meli presents, the Kunstinstitut Meli's renaming presents, is on the one hand is that it was done really by a group of people through collective learning, and that was the first position that I opened when I had the opportunity to do so at my arrival at the institution, a curator of collective learning. And the team really bringing thinkers and makers into the team, meaning people that can help us think, but also people that know how to make that thinking into articulation. But for sure, again, the name Meli, which is drawn from Meli Sham, the protagonist of an artwork by Ken Lam, is in itself rooted in a history of immigration, on how difficult it is for immigrants to move to a country and to have to work and to make a better environment for the future generations. And that was the background of Meli Sham herself and of Ken Lam, the protagonist and the author of an artwork that hangs in our building and which inspires the name of our institution. So immigration again, or diaspora again, is part of the history of that naming, of that renaming.
Yeah, thank you very much, Sophia. Are there any questions that we could take, or can we shift to?
We can shift, and yes, please send your questions on the chat. I'm also curious to know if Rolando wants to.
Rolando, would you like to
something?
maybe comment on what you've heard so far? We lost you, I think.
No.
There you are.
I'm here. No, I think it's good if we open to more questions or comments. Because we don't have too much time.
Yeah.
I'm very happy of what Sophia is bringing to the table about learning. So how a collaborative project should be about learning.
Yeah.
About producing relations, about the politics of listening. So I think there are many very good contributions that are already showing where we are going, I think, with this questioning. Because, I mean, this is a point of questioning to open ways.
Thank you. Yeah. And maybe, Vera Windhagen, you're part of the new European Bauhaus team. Would you want to say something, or would you rather than, at this point, hear us out and maybe say something later? Is there...
I think I just listened. I took a lot of notes.
Obviously, and we'll send you the recording too. So
yeah, that would be great. That would be great. I think maybe now I just listen. I was thinking that actually the slogan of the European Union is now united in diversity.
Yeah.
But are we making use of this diversity? That's maybe the question. But,
exactly. But you did add inclusivity to the as the third pillar in the new European Bauhaus project, which I really think is great. But then there is beauty, and there is sustainability, and there is inclusivity, right? Those are the three pillars at the moment.
And beauty is not beauty, but more quality of experience.
Okay.
Because beauty is subjective, of course. So.
Okay, great. So thank you, Vera. We have two more interventions, as maybe we can call it like that. Can I give Clementine maybe a moment to deliberate and say something about your views? Thank you very much. And would you mind saying something about yourself and who you are? So
Thank you, Hisham. Thank you, Rolando. I'm sitting in a Bauhaus building in Berlin with a poster on the back of my wall which says Europe or Die, which sounds very different now to what it did in 4 years ago when the students in Paris brought it out as something they wanted to work on. I'm an associate curator at KW, Institute for Contemporary Art in Berlin, but I'm also the co-director with Azun Nwagbogu of Generator in Lagos. So it's a long-term project to look at restitution from an African perspective. And I've always been interested in what makes an institution. Obviously, people, more than anything, certainly more than curricula. And I think what I want to pull out now are a few points to do with this question, first of all, of the combination that Bauhaus proposes between utopia and functionalism. And sadly, I don't believe at all that we're working towards any kind of utopia right now. At least our utopia is muddied by very grave environmental concerns, not to mention the pandemic. But it's curious to go back and to read an artist, an important artist who was interested in the environment and in happenings, Alan Capro, to look at his idea of the education of the young artist that is now 50 years old. And I just want to quote him. He says, "The most important short-range prediction that can be made has been implied over and over again in the foregoing, that the actual, probably global environment will engage us in an increasingly participational way. The environment will not be the environments with a big E that we are familiar with already, the constructed funhouse, the spook show, the window display, the storefront and obstacle course. These have been sponsored," he says, "by art galleries and discotheques. Instead, we'll act in response to the given natural and urban environments such as the sky, the ocean floor, winter resorts, motels, the movement of cars, public services, and the communications media." So, I mean, of course, it has a slightly anachronistic or arcane language to it, but it still proves that, you know, this question that comes up again and is on the lips of everybody at the moment, this question of infrastructural change, I think is extremely important. But at the same time, we're in a process where, you know, repurposing, I agree, old institutions requires, again, a very complex engagement with remediation. In other words, with a process of healing, and mediatic engagement, a kind of shifting, an ability, sort of even the courage to translocate, to transmediate, to even do that on a very physical level. Listening, obviously, humbling. And I want to talk about a few blockages at the moment, which I think are being rendered much more visible by the pandemic. The first one is economy. So I have never in my life written so many funding applications. I have never felt more paranoid than I am now, that I am literally bending everything to suit a group of people who are most likely not going to follow through the projects that I'm proposing, even under the auspices of a recognized institution. I feel that with the public and the private, we've got to a point where, can you imagine now taking a tube and turning it the other way around, as if the skin that we had, the skin that is necessary to protect us, has been turned inside out, so that everything is about public output, to the point that the museums, the kind of ergonomy of our body is also inside out. Our bodies in a workspace is very complicated. I mean, the museum at the moment, if I had a chance, I'd make it into a lazarette. I would want to change the way we hang works. The normativity that we work with at the moment is appalling. And it has directly to do with ergonomy, with the relationship between the human body, the environment, ecology, technology. And I think that our agency within this process now is incredibly important. We need to develop a new use of these institutions that we've worked within and obviously inherited, that are all colonial but are all civic. In other words, the art academy or art college, the museum and the university, the three need to be clashed in a way. Because even if you go to a museum, you can just see the way people stand, they stare, they swipe. There are no chairs, there are no tables. It's absolutely inhuman in that sense. And the new project, the new Bauhaus project, as you are all quite rightly pointing to, it isn't tapping into knowledge that is actually in Europe and has been in Europe for, definitely since, the beginning of the 20th century, the beginning of the Bauhaus, and it's deeply underexposed. So we are facing 100 years of creolization, not to mention earlier forms of creolization. We have a diasporic youth. I'm proud to say that students at the Hamburg Academy, where until recently I was a guest professor, named their collective Birds of Knowledge, which was for me the most untypical kind of artist collective name that you could find, but it made sense. They were migratory birds and they were bringing knowledge across borders. So I think we need to, so what I'm doing at KW is actually to build a new faculty. I'm not saying a department, I'm not saying a curriculum, I'm saying faculty as in competences. Because I feel that this new faculty, which in this case includes a novelist, a composer, a publisher, a feminist anthropologist, designers, an art historian, 5 artists and a lawyer from Senegal, as it happens, that we need to develop new methodologies, because the decolonial, from my perspective as a white European woman, is definitely not, it's definitely, if you like, the breaking down of the disciplinary divisions that we're still working with, art history, anthropology, whichever other ones come into play at any particular point. And I think that the most crucial issue for me in all of this is the collections that are being constantly and without much critique hoarded in European museums. Now these are, again, to bring Alan Capro back into the game, these contain stored code. To decipher them requires a kind of, it's a kind of an engineered confusion between histories, roles, and disciplines, or what he would have called signal scrambling. And when you look at the moment at the debates around restitution, and we all have to say that restitution really is the most important, it's quite clear that what is going on is a series of discussions between European ministries of culture, where restitution becomes a proxy for something very, very different. So the moment that right now the German foreign ministry has declared that they're also going to send back their Benin bronzes, but it's a very slow process. It has to do with 2 groups of people in particular, academics and activists. A very strange combi that is in all the literature all the time. It has very little to do with people who might go and see these objects back in Benin City or where else. So when you think about Europe today, you have to imagine that under the ground, in the crypts, be it in Berlin, London, Amsterdam, or elsewhere, there are pretty much the chattels of slavery. There are huge amounts of material that are actually being prevented from being seen and worked on by people of African and Asian descent. They have to have the right to look at this material. You can't tell me that decolonial art history is going to be a discursive enterprise. There has to be a new architectural and epistemological and social and economic development around these collections, because it's the only way that we are going to think of new economic structures, think of regaining a lost authorship, retrieving the names of guilds, trying to work on new patents, trying to work on the design and engineering that could be extrapolated from these extraordinary artifacts that are being held, if you like, held hostage in European museums. And the weird thing is that you wonder why they hold on to the stuff that isn't, you know, the big ritual object. Why are they worried about 4 to 5 million objects of design that come from other parts of the world? Why aren't they letting people of African and Asian descent work on this material? Why is there no access and redesign of this, of these collections? So I think that we need to, when I try and think of what this new institution would be, I do think of necessarily a kind of a circular engagement between, serious teaching, rigorous teaching, research and production, or maybe a different way of working. Maybe we should speak not of research anymore, which is in itself a colonial term, but inquiry, maybe of spaces of learning. And if I take an institution like the Jan van Eyck, which is generously hosting this debate today, then I wonder how you can engage young emerging artists in this question of ecology? How can you bring them into the institution and encourage them to feel affiliated with the institution? Less individualistic, more inclusive, sure, but equally, how can you encourage them to have a greater sense of responsibility, of building something together? And I'm not sure how this happens, because if you were to say, okay, they become members of this project, membership doesn't sound terribly inclusive, does it, right? It's like a lodge or a club. So maybe but at the same time, we want them to be companions of transformation, right? We want them to invest in this institution, which is not a bad thing. It's a coming together of people who want to, in a way, formalize their experience. And maybe this is this kind of intergenerational moment that we're living through, where we have to maybe create a situation where every institution has a kind of a bipolar or a bipartite activity that goes on within it, and that if you engage in a university, you can also engage in a kind of companionship of transformation. Mm-hmm. So I guess to conclude, I'm less worried about the name, although I recognize it as a really crucial political instrument. I'm much more interested at the moment in how we deal with the public and this condition in which we're faced with. The backstage, the front of stage, this consumerist imperative, and how we can think about developing or repurposing institutions, remediating collections, and developing a kind of a stronger focus on ergonomy, on the human body, in particular today, on ecology, but also on the economics of what we're doing, more microfinance, more responsibility on the part of the students to have a kind of an ownership in the institution, and epistemology, an unpleasant word, but it says what it is, and maybe that's what I would like to end on. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Clémentine. Would you like to add to that, or shall we move to our last intervention here, and then maybe we have time for a couple of questions afterwards, and then yeah. So Petra, might you? I don't see all the screens, so I can't point towards. Petra, might you want to say something, maybe on what you think of the naming and how you would see the project move forward, and maybe if you can explain a little bit who you are and in what context you are here as well.
Yes, of course, Hisham. Thank you, and thank you for having us all here together. I'm a head of research at St. Lucas School of Arts in Antwerp, where I'm coordinating the PhDs and the research projects, and I'm also organizing an advanced master in artistic research in a social political context. It's a long title. So I'm all for long titles and not for long names and not for short names. But I mean, there has been so much said already tonight, and so many interesting things from so many different perspectives. And I can, I mean, it was great listening actually tonight, and it was also, even though things that have been said are hard things and painful things, and we should also take that into account. It's not easy journey or easy to recognize these things and to face these things, and this kind of new, what was it again? New Bauhaus, yeah, has this kind of a certain kind of optimism that is a naive optimism, and that is actually insulting many of us. And I think this is one of, I mean, what's in a name? And I think if in a name there is something that is so insulting because it's silencing so many histories, so many communities. Then I think, I mean, there is something to be said, even from a rhetoric point of view, to change this and to really change this, because this is not a way of uniting in a sustainable, inclusive, beautiful way. For me, this is, I mean, when I first heard this name, New Bauhaus, I had a problem with the new, because whenever the word new is used, you know, we are in a rhetoric enterprise that wants to put up a smokescreen in front of something. The word new itself is, of course, problematic from a decolonial perspective. So I think this is, I mean, for me, the new is the first signal of something is going wrong here. And I just want to bring like my small perspective from an art school. And I must say, like, in art schools, the new Bauhaus is there, in the sense of it's like a continuous recycling of an ideology of Bauhaus that is still very dominant in art education. And I must say all over Europe, actually. And that doesn't mean that there are not like great things being done in art education, and they are, but it is a struggle, and it is an everyday struggle. Yesterday still, or I heard somebody saying, it seems like art schools are radical experiments in white male identity politics. And it might sound a bit controversial to put it that way, but I mean, I think some of Europe must underestimate what's going on in art schools and how and in what kind of violence is still being, art is still being educated. And I think in the first place, violence against students with a migration background, students of color, women also. I mean, we have great examples, painful, violent examples that came into the media the last weeks, months in the Netherlands, but this is not an exception. This is still the situation in a lot of art education. So when I hear new Bauhaus, I ask Europe, what kind of message are you sending to young artists, young designers, young architects who are now in art schools and are still living this kind of Bauhaus as it has been and as it still is every day again? I mean, if that is the ideal that Europe is propagating openly, affirmatively to the young generation, knowing what they experience and what they have experienced and in what kind of history they stand, then for me this is, even if it's only about a name, it's worrisome, it's troublesome, it's problematic. I mean, these are the ones that we give the past towards and we accompany them into the future. I mean, if this is like this kind of spitting in their face, I would say, I'm sorry that I'm so direct about it. Of course, the whole problem is much broader, and even in the name of the Green Deal, some of you have already mentioned it, the question of deal is also such a problematic word. What does it say? What is the history of the word deal, of the deals that have been made? But just the fact, the word in itself also, a deal, it means a certain kind of negotiating, a power relation, parties sitting at a table, getting away with things, pushing their agendas forward. I mean, if we talk about what, who, and how, the deal is probably not the how we want. So it's a broader framework of problematic use of language that's not just language. It shows how we think about things, how we think about being together, working together, living together, and giving the past to the future. And yeah, this, I think it's deeply saddening, actually. Okay. So for a name or for a new name, I would think of, can we not go into the direction of the how? I mean, I heard Charles, what Charles says about never again, but never again in itself is was such a problematic slogan, in the sense that it also served very well as a smokescreen, never again to go on business as usual in the rest of the world. So our never again was almost a facilitator to continue violence on a huge scale on outside Europe. So I mean, names are often smokescreens to continue business as usual. And here at least there is the transparency of what the message is, new Bauhaus. We know actually then what's the deal on the table. Hans has beautifully talked about all the difficult, not all the violent and problematic dimensions of Bauhaus. I would want to bring its sexism and its stealing and silencing of women also to the table. But at least there is this clarity of the new, which is a very colonial word, and the Bauhaus, which is a violent tradition. So we know what's on the table, and the deal is already saying it. It's very clear. It's also clear who is on the table if we look at it. And what Clémentine was saying, there's not much. And what Sophia was saying, the idea of schooling, of knowledges, of sharing, is not at that table. So yeah, maybe I'm a bit too harsh here, but it's how I feel it. Thank you, Rolando, for beautiful things you said, but because your words also make us think and make us question and make us stand still. And when we were talking about time, I could only think of Audre Lorde's idea of the master's tools, but I think also the master's clock will not set our time. And when Clémentine was talking about the writing of proposals and the writing again of proposals, and how this kind of rhythm, which I would almost call a military rhythm or a pornographic rhythm, that makes us also participate in these kind of new deals and in these kind of new Bauhaus projects, is that kind of clock will set at our time. That's maybe the question I want to end with. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much, Petra. Thank you.
There's a comment in the chat that adds to what Petra just said from Monica Moisen. Monica, please do interrupt me if you wish to say this yourself. Feel free to join the conversation. But in the meantime, maybe I can start reading. To this excellent input, I would like to add the need to also consider a call for legislative reform of the European legal system, especially when it comes to the Eurocentric intellectual property system that in all European countries considers traditional knowledge and traditional cultural expressions as part of the public domain and is promoting the concept of individual ownership in the detriment of community-owned rights. Novelty, originality, and usually individual authorship are requirements for IP protection. The IP system does not nurture relationships based on custodianship, guardianship, knowledge continuity, and knowledge sharing. Traditional knowledge, vernacular architecture, design thinking extracted from cultural artifacts, all this is extraordinary valuable knowledge and can enrich our current reality. To understand, use, and recontextualize these intangible assets requires systems of reparation, compensation, and integration of the source communities in these processes. Thank you very much, Monica.
Thank you. Malkies, did you finish before, or would you like to still make some sort of statement, or is it okay? That's okay too.
No, I didn't prepare a statement.
Okay, that's fine. That's fine. I heard you had a power outage in New York, so it was
upstate.
Upstate.
Now
Okay.
we're back in Brooklyn. But
Okay.
yeah.
Okay. Yeah. No problem. Thank you very much. So, if there are no questions, I would like to thank you all very, very, very much for your contributions and for having this discussion, because it's most importantly. There's one question.
Yeah.
Okay, let's do it. Thank you.
Vera wants to add something.
Yeah.
Please,
Yeah,
Vera,
can I add, because I was very moved by what Petra was saying, and I'm a designer myself. I work in the European Commission, but it's tough. We are in a top-down institution trying to build things bottom-up, and my question is, how could we do this? And also, how can we make what you are saying right now known to the legislative people, known to the... So I was reflecting on the meeting tonight. Can we step out of the silo here and also share the conversation in a bigger group with more people from different backgrounds in terms of different professions, can we also enlarge the conversation there? Because I think it would be very valuable to let your voice be heard also in that sense. So not only about diversity in different backgrounds, but also different tables, different types of, so take the discussion out of that. That's maybe my reflection on what I hear. And this is, maybe my last call also for you to enlarge the impact of the conversation that we're having. And that's all maybe.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, and then I'm thinking, like, do we enlarge the impact, or is the impact that we are putting forward large enough by itself? It's like, are we talking, because we would want to do that, we would want to enlarge the impact, but maybe I turn the question back to you. How would you help us to get what we are saying here out there?
Well, the easy answer, but I don't know if the easy answer is, and this is our way of trying to be as transparent as also as inclusive as possible, is to post everything that we have been saying today on the website, because that's the platform that we made until now to be as as inclusive, and I understand very well that this is only one. It's one table. It's one. If we defined how the table looks like, we defined how we should. But if you have proposals to do it in a different way, we are also open for that. So we're very open, and I think this is a unique opportunity to actually make a change. And any proposal on that side is very welcome. And maybe it's something also to think about for this group, how this could be.
Thank you very much. And anyone would like to add something to that? Rolando, would you like to add something?
Thank you, Hisham. Well, a couple of things. Wanted to say thank you to Petra as well. And picking up quickly on the question of time, one of the big questions for us against the idea of novelty or the new is that it leads to forgetting. So modernity is based on an amnesic society. That's why the call is to remember who we are, to witness what we have become, because we cannot know what we have become if we live in this amnesic reality, just pushing for novelty all the time, and a novelty that is destroying the earth, etc. So the question of time sits at the center because the call for relational forms, for communal forms, for vernacular forms is a call to weave back. And the way we write it is remembering, so putting together what has been dismembered. So our separation from earth, from community, from time. That is a project of modernity, of the creation of this isolated individual. So I thank you for bringing this question to the new, that is very essential to the power of the merchandise. I mean, from Walter Benjamin, for example, to the logic of capitalism and how we are subjected to an amnesic system of anxiety, desire, running, etc. But it's a very long conversation, but I think it is essential to look at time as a system, not of going into circularity, but going into remembering. So this positioned recognition of who we are in time, in a time that is plural and that has parts of history that we might not like, but that are there, and we should acknowledge. The other part I want to say, Hisham, is that how wonderful it is that I think we have the elements of coalition building, because I mean, this is also from the wisdom of the, let's say, the Zapatista political theory, that is, there is one no, but multiple yeses. So today, I think we heard that there is a common agreement that we need to overcome that legacy that is leading to destruction of the earth and to the exploitation of others, the denigration of others. But we all have very different responses. And that is the element for coalition, because there is no search for one response. There is search for that space of coalition where these multiple responses can come in.
from being centered in the First Nations of Europe to center in education, to repurposing institutions, to gender. So all these responses we had tonight are, we are in an agreement that that model is not leading us anywhere. So that's a one no, but we have multiple yeses and we can be in conversation if nobody wants to impose their yes on top of the other. So I think this is the politics of listening, and I think this is one of the beauties of the colonial critique, is that it is not leading towards an end point like a nihilism, right? But it is opening. Mm-hmm. It is saying we don't want this anymore, but there is many possibilities, and I think the conversation tonight showed that. So I'm really hopeful that we are opening paths for these coalitions to be built, and I think Vera's invitation to expand the conversation is very valuable, to bring the knowledge that has been generated in these circles connected to universities and art institutions, to bring it broader in society, that where these discussions are also happening in many other places, but we are not connected, you know. So this is, I think, the challenge, how to create these conversations.
And what do you think of the comment of Vera? Can we broaden up the base of people connected to this, let's say, coalition, also from different professions, etc.? What would you say on that? Because it really gives me feeling, and with all respect, Vera, I understand completely why you're saying it, and we should do this, but it's a bit painful for me, because I feel here we are, all these professionals from the arts world. Here we are doing our utmost best, but we need to broaden it. We need more people. We need, and so how many people do we need to be listened to? You know, so that's for me, like, I want to state that, and yeah. Anyways, what would you say, Rolando, to that? Because we do want other people to sit at the table, but it would be good if the European Commission could just take this as a sign and to see this as something that they could learn from. And
yes, I think, I mean, the colonial perspective is more autonomous, you know. So actually, the way we decided to organize this forum is not waiting for the Commission to open the space for the forum to be made and the funding, but just doing it our own, you know, with our own strength. And I think this is one of the problems of the modernist imaginary, if we call it modernist. And I see it also with my students, for example, that they find no way out if they are not heard by the state or by the institutions. Whereas when you are in Mexico or Colombia or in the global south, people are not waiting to be heard by the state. They are doing the things. They are enacting the transformation they want to happen. And I think this is part of the beauty of building these coalitions without waiting to have a funding proposal approved, to get the money so that we can do something we want to do. I think we are doing, and by doing, we can just set the process. And if funding comes at some point, of course, we can redirect it for this purpose. I like very much what Boaventura Sousa Santos says, using hegemonic means for counter-hegemonic purposes. So it's not a denial of those processes, but we will not be stopping just asking for more institutional life. We should have our conversations with our own strength, you know? And so I think this is what limits the imaginary, when people are protesting to have more possibilities of institutions feeding them. And I think in the global south, this has been overturned because there is a complete failure of many institutions, and there is this awareness that the way to become human in many places is not through being recognized by the university or the museum, but by creating your own strength, you know. So I think we have a lot to learn from these struggles for autonomy, from the social movements, from the global south. And I think already having this conversation here among us and not waiting to be invited at the table or waiting for funding is very important, because we are really creating our own thinking, you know.
Okay.
So our own being together, which is, I mean, lastly, one of the things that the project of modernity does is that it replaces relations by mediations. So you relate to people through institutions, through roles, through the market, and not anymore as relations. So I think the recreation of relations is fundamental to give sense to what we do. We don't wait for the sense to come from the top or because the funding got approved or et cetera, et cetera. So I think this is very important. We should not confuse the two, right? We can work with it if we can make it useful for what we think together. So, and not the reverse, not waiting to think until we receive the support. You know? So that's why I'm so glad we are just doing it with our own strength. You know?
Thank you so much, and thank you all again very much. Thank you, Vera. Thank you, all the listeners, all the speakers, all the people who were part of this, all the team members, everybody who is part of making this great effort. And I would want to bid you a very well night or midday, wherever you are, and see you next time. We'll move forward with this. Okay.
Yes.
Thank you. Bye.